Hey everybody, thanks for tuning back into OTRAM's YouTube channel. Today we've got a 9380 series with a 1FZ-FE motor, and we're replacing the front main seal and the O-ring on the timing, not on the timing cover, on the oil pump cover. So I figured I would do a video showing how to do this job, since it seems like every 80 series needs an oil pump cover seal. In an effort to make this a slightly shorter video, I've already taken the grill out, I've taken the battery and the battery box out, and I've undone the radiator hoses. I was gonna go ahead and pull the headlights, but I figured I would stop and put that on video in case people didn't know the trick for getting the corner lights out. So let me show you that. There's just one Phillips screw here in the top corner of them. So we'll go ahead and pop both of those out. And then you just come alongside of it. Move the camera a bit. You just come alongside and you kind of smack them forwards. It's like you just want to drive it forwards, not inwards, just straight up. And then you just unclip them. And then you can actually get access to get the headlights out. Pop the other one real quick. And it seems kind of violent and like you're going to break something. But that seems to be the easiest way to get those out. I'll set that aside. And now we can go ahead and pull the headlights. And that's just a couple of 10mm bolts. There's two here at the top. And then there's one under here. And one back behind that marker light. You don't necessarily have to take the headlights out, but I'll show you here in just a minute why I take them out. And then you can just reach behind here and unplug the light bulbs. I don't know, I'll flip it around once I pull them out so you can see. Come on. You can just unsnap the harness from the back of the bulbs. We go and get those out of the way. And the reason we pulled those is the upper radiator has a stud that comes through the core support here, and it's partially obstructed by the AC condenser. You can snake, a bunch of swivels and a long socket in there and get on that, but a lot of times it's faster and easier just to pull the headlights out of the way and be done with it. And you don't absolutely have to pull the radiator to do this job. I find it's easier to pull the radiator in order to do it right. It gives me room to get the torque wrench in there. It gives me room to get a breaker bar in there to pull the crank bolt. And there's no chance of me accidentally slipping and hitting the radiator core while I'm in there working. So, it adds a little bit of time to the job to go through the hassle of pulling the radiator, but I think it outweighs the issues that you could have not pulling the radiator. Now, where this stud goes through, it goes through on the inside to a rubber bushing sleeve. Let me spin you around. I don't know if I can make it so you can see that, but it's right down here behind this AC bracket. So I'm going to pop this AC bracket out to give me a little bit more clearance so that I can get in with a pair of vice grips and hold that rubber bushing. So let me grab a ratchet so I can get in there. The 95 to 97 80 series don't have this guy up here, so it's a little bit easier to access. It's just the 93, 94s that it sits here in the way. There we go. Now my wrench is stuck. There we go. And you want to be careful moving this bracket out of the way because you are bending the aluminum lines. So be gentle with it so that you don't break them because they're becoming obsolete. And now we can get in there and actually grab this stud with a pair of pliers. And we can drop everything, but there we can get the nut, and it's a sleeved nut. So this part here is what we were gripping with the pliers. Goes off to the side. Now this, let me move the camera again. Over on this side, the condenser is blocking a straight shot at the nut that we need to remove. So what we can end up doing there is there's two brackets coming down from the core support. There's one on the driver's side and this little 10 millimeter here on the passenger side. If you just loosen those, they give you enough play that you can push the condenser sideways and get to that bolt. Now we can snake it in there and take that bolt out. Come on. Well, that sleeve is seized in, so we're just going to leave that in there. And then if you go down the side of the radiator straight down, there's two long 12 millimeter headed bolts that go vertical that hold the radiator in. So we're just going to use a long extension and go straight down and pull those. Okay, we're going to use a long extension and a ratchet to break those free. And then it's just a long vertical bolt. There's another one on the other side. So that's all free. And now we need to take the fan shroud off and the fan itself, and then we can lift the radiator up out. So I'm going to move you back again. I'm going to try to raise you up and see if I can tilt it down. You're probably still not going to be able to see well, but hopefully you'll get the gist of things. Let me grab a long wrench. And I think I'm going to grab my step stool. Before I actually try to pull the fan, or before I pull the shroud rather, I'm going to pull the fan loose, and then we're going to take them all out at one time. And there's 4 nuts down here holding the fan clutch onto the water pump. So we're just going to take those off one at a time. And they're going to want to stick. So if you just give them a sharp jerking motion with the ratchet, or the wrench rather, usually they'll come loose. Sometimes you end up having to jam something in between the studs and the water pump to give you something to grip on. And apparently somebody's been in here before, because one of these is a 13 instead of a 12. So I'm going to get that one off, that's a 12. And grab a 13 real quick. There's nothing more annoying than when people put the wrong sized wrench head bolts back on. But the Japanese sized stuff is hard to find, so it happens quite a bit. We keep a fairly decent stock of the Japanese hardware here, just because it's a pet peeve of mine to have the right wrench sizes. So there we go. The water pump, or the fan clutch is loose at the front of the water pump. And we're gonna just wiggle a little bit and it'll pop off the front of the hub. And then there's 2 bolts holding the fan shroud onto the radiator. And they're 12 millimeters as well. And we're going to pop those off. Put those bolts off to the side. And then down low here on the fan shroud, a lot of times there's one of the transmission cooler lines will be clipped onto the shroud. This one's actually not. Somebody has broken the clips off, so we just need to wiggle the shroud up. And why are we stuck? And then you wiggle the shroud and the fan out pretty much at the same time. I'm going to move the fan over a little bit because somebody's done something funky over here on the driver's side. And the shroud, there it goes. There we go, and then you can just lift the fan and the shroud out as a pair. We'll come set them off to the side. And now, I've already got the lower radiator hose undone at the engine. I've got this one undone. I've got the little steam vent unhooked and tucked out of the way. There's 2 trans-cooler lines down here. And I'm going to put pinch-off clamps on those real quick so they don't leak all over the floor when I pull them out. If I can find the pinch-off clamps. There we go. Danny reorganized my pliers drawer and now I can't find anything. And I like to stick these on before I undo the lines. That way it's just less of a mess, less stuff going all over the floor. But these, somebody's done something funky with the lines down here. So I'm going to pull the lines and then put the clamps on. a used car lot apparently did a bunch of quote-unquote repairs to this. And yeah, I think a lot of it would have been better off just having been not done. So we got those off. And they put the factory clamps as well as a set of aftermarket worm gear clamps on here. So get that slid back. I'll wiggle this hose loose. And you're going to lose some coolant, or not coolant rather, transmission fluid out of the radiator when you pop the lines loose. But it's, still best to cap these hoses just so they don't continue to drip the whole time you're working under here. And you can stick those down out of the way. Let's see if we can get the other side to come loose. Another pet peeve of mine is when you put the clamps back on, put them back in a direction that's easily accessible for the next guy that has to come in here and do work. It doesn't take that much more effort, and it could save you or the next guy a lot of hassle the next time you're in here. Whew. These are not wanting to come loose. Let me see if I can find. I must have put it out somewhere already. A hose pick plier is really handy in situations like this because you can get in under the hose and break the grip it's got on the pipe nipple, and it makes it much easier to pull loose. And I just dropped my pincher clamp. I'll go ahead and stick this on the end of this hose and lock it off. So now everything is free from the radiator, and you just got to kind of wiggle it in and out to get it loose, but it'll pull pretty much straight up, and we can go set this off to the side. Okay, and now we're getting down to where we actually have access to the front crank. I'm going to go ahead, the the alternator belts are already loose because we took this front pulley off. So they're loose, we don't really need to mess with them. I'm going to go ahead and take the alternator belt off. It's just a matter of loosening the front lock nut on the pulley and then spinning the adjuster up. I'll go ahead and do that off camera. And then I'm going to readjust the camera so that you can get a better view of what we're actually doing down here, and I'll bring you right back. Okay, so we've got the radiator out of the way. I've gone ahead and sprayed off the front of the timing cover to get some of the grime off. It makes it a lot easier to drive the Phillips screwdriver into the end of the pump cover screws and lessens your chances of stripping them out. But to gain access to the pump cover, we've got to take the balancer pulley off. A lot of people will use the trick where you jam a breaker bar under the frame rail and bump the starter. I've used that in the past with some success. I don't like doing it that way because when the breaker bar breaks, it goes flying across the shop. So what I usually use is it's just a homemade crank pulley holder for the 1FZ. The guys at the shop next door have a plasma cutter, so I drew this up and had them burn me one out real quick. And it makes this job a lot simpler and a lot safer. And I did not get my ratchet out beforehand, so let me find that real quick. It just bolts onto the front of the pulley with two 8mm bolts into the existing holes. And it gives something to counter your breaker bar as you're pulling. And I should have spun that around the other way before bolting it up, but let's see if we can go ahead and get it to work this way. We may have to reposition it, because normally I flop it over here. Actually, you know what? I'm just going to go ahead and do that now before I tighten it all the way up. Let's move that out of the way real quick. Grab my big ratchet and 30mm socket. We can go ahead and turn that so that it'll line up and put me in the right direction to remove this without hitting anything. That should work. Now where did I just put my two screws? There we go. It was a long weekend, and I'm not quite rested enough. There we go. I'm actually going to run those in with the impact. And let me find a punch real quick to stick behind there. It likes to slide down the edge of this wheel liner, so it helps to put a punch in there. And now we can loosen up that bolt. That one actually came loose easier than they normally do. There's been times I've had to get the torque multiplier out, and you just sit there and snap sockets until it comes free. I'm done with this guy for now. And then we can take this big nut out of the front. Go. And it's just a gigantic bolt. And we wiggle the crank pulley off, and sometimes this will stick and just not want to come off, but if you just kind of lightly tap it with a hammer, like a brass hammer, you can get it to come loose, or you can put a puller on it. You want to make sure that the sealing surface here doesn't have any grooves worn into it. This one looks pretty good, but if it's grooved, when you go to put this front crank seal back in, it won't seal because it'll just be riding in the groove. And we go ahead, since we've got that pulley already off, it wouldn't make sense not to do the seal while we're in here. We'll go ahead and pull that guy out real quick. And you want to, there's a keyway here on the end of the crank. Pay attention to that. It's fairly easy to knock it loose and down into the timing cover, which is very difficult to get it back out. So just pay attention to that and don't knock it into the cover. And now we're down finally to our actual oil pump. These are number 3 JS cross screws. And what I like to do, because I see a lot of these that have been butchered, I find the easiest way to get them out is to take a nice, I use a new number 3 Phillips each time I do this. Actually tap it into the screw with a hammer, and then little impact wrench, and they come right out. If for some reason yours are boogered and won't come out, the guy that sells the pesky heater hose kits, I think it's phh.com, but I'm not positive. He sells a torque screw set for the front of it. That it makes a nice replacement, and then you don't have to worry about stripping those out. But the act of actually hammering that bit in frees up the threads and makes them easy to take out and then drop into your coolant bucket. And then just work your way around, and they'll all come out, hopefully. There's a couple of times I've had to weld nuts onto these to get them out. And I did the nut welding trick rather than drilling, because I didn't want to drill crooked into the timing cover and then have to get a new timing cover. So welding nuts onto them seemed to be the safer course of action. Got this one, and I think one more to do. That should be all of them. Some of the trucks will have an idler pulley bolted onto the front of the oil pump cover here. This one doesn't, but there may be a bolt there. Then you can just take a mallet or a hammer and just lightly tap that. And you want to do it lightly in case you missed a screw, because you don't want to break it. And then there's the pump cover off. I'm going to put that in the parts washer. I'm going to grab a little pick and we'll fish the O-ring out. There's an O-ring down here in this groove. kind of work it out. And a lot of the time, these will be so brittle that they'll just shatter. You can kind of see this one coming apart as I take it out. But they're really brittle, and that's why they're leaking. So we'll go ahead and pull all that out. I'm going to let that drip drain for a little bit. One of the other reasons I went ahead and kind of pre-washed this area down before we took the cover off is if there's a whole bunch of dirt and crud sitting up here on this ledge, when you pop the cover, there's a chance of it falling into the oil pump down into the oil pan. So you just want to keep this area as clean as you possibly can. So I'm going to run the cover through the parts washer. I'll let this drip a little bit and then clean it up, and then we'll come back for reassembly. So I'll just see you guys in just a little bit. Okay, so we've got everything all cleaned up and ready to go back together. So, I've washed this down better to make sure there's no grit or anything in the oil pump. And then the timing cover itself is nice and clean. So what I like to do, you can use grease. We've got this transmission assembly lube that makes this easy, but you just take a little bit of it and a couple of spots around the groove where the O-ring's going to go. You just stick some of this and pack it into the groove there. And what this will do is help hold the O-ring in place while you're trying to get the cover back on. It's a pain when the O-ring keeps trying to fall out while you're trying to get everything bolted up. And then you can just take the O-ring, and it's pre-formed, so you just got to kind of match the shapes up and then just stick it in the groove and run it around and just make sure that it's all lined up and seated in its groove. And it helps if you kind of just run your finger around it and smear that assembly lube or grease, and that'll help hold it all in. And then you can just grab all the screws you took out and your socket. Set those over there. And then it helps if you put the pump cover straight on. It seems like if you swivel it, it wants to pull that O-ring back out of the groove. So I just kind of flop it straight on there. Start my screws in. And get my socket on here. Make it a little bit easier. And you want to just lightly put them in until you've got all of them in. It'll make it easier to line up the holes. We're going to have to fish the one out that I dropped into the bucket because I just remembered that I dropped one in the coolant. But we'll get all these started first. And here we go. See if I can find that last one in the bucket. That's not it. There we go. And that's gross. And I'm going to change gloves real quick because that was disgusting. go ahead and finish loosely putting that one in. And then I just take a 1/4-inch ratchet and just snug them all. You want them tight, but you don't want to strip them out of that aluminum cover or break them. And I've never actually seen a torque spec on these, so it's just kind of do it by feel. And just go around, I go around twice just to make sure that I got all of them and that nothing moved and seated crooked and threw my torque out of whack. Well, not that I'm torquing it, but that one didn't end up loose. So there we go. So that's basically the oil pump cover back on, and we just need to put our front seal in. I've already taken a rag and wiped the inside of the seal bore out with, I'm going brain dead, with brake clean to make sure it's a clean bore. And then I've got the new Toyota seal. And what I like to do, it seems to make them easier to install, is I just take a light coat of the Toyota form-in-place gasket maker and just put it, around the outside edge of the seal. And it kind of lubricates it while you're trying to slide it in, and then it also seems to lock it in once you're all done. And then you can just kind of smoosh it back in with your fingers, usually. There we go. You just want to smush it back in and just make sure it's flush all the way around, so it's in there straight. And they make seal drivers for doing this. I find it's easier just to do it with my fingers. Every now and then I'll tap it in with a plastic mallet if they're fighting me. But yeah, so get the seal in there nice and flush, clean up your extra goo. And then I take the balancer and I just wipe some of the same assembly goo or grease that I use to hold the O-ring in. Wipe that around the snout on the balancer pulley. To make sure we don't run the seal dry. And then as you come down, just look to make sure make sure once more that the keyway is still there. And then as you slide the pulley on, rock it to make sure that the keyway didn't get knocked into the oil pan. And then it's still on there. And then we're going to take the big bolt, and I'm going to walk over here to where I've got some engine oil open. And we're going to lubricate the threads lightly. And then in between the washer and the bolt head and on the threads themselves. And we're going to thread that guy back in its hole. And here is where this job gets a little bit trickier. A lot of guys just either run this on with an impact until the impact stops, or they jam it on as hard as they can, with a breaker bar. But you really don't know how much torque you're applying when you do it that way. And this is clamping the gear that drives your oil pump as well as your power steering. So if this bolt isn't tight enough, you're not going to generate the clamping force, and there's a chance that your oil pump doesn't spin, which obviously is not something that you want. So I'm going to spin this around again so that we can line up and put our counter brace back on. Except this time we're putting it so it hits the driver's side fender because we're tightening. Let me run those in real quick. Go. I'll move my pin over to here, and on this side it helps if you stick a pry bar through the headlight hole so that this is coming down against the pry bar and seated. That'll keep you from squishing these brake lines that are under here. And I should have gotten it out before I started the film, but let me grab my torque wrench. And this is where, I don't know if you can rent these, but if you can rent one, borrow one, any way that you can to get a torque wrench that goes up to at least 308 foot-pounds, so that you can actually torque this bolt. I've got this one that's a monster, but it actually was pretty reasonable. It's a Precision Instruments. It's 3/4 inch drive. I got it off Amazon, and it was, it was really reasonable, especially, for the amount of these as we do. I didn't like the idea of not knowing how much torque was being applied. But now we can stick the big torque wrench on there. And I like to hit it a couple of times just to make sure. And we're good there. So now we're torqued. The other option, if you can't find a big torque wrench like that, is to use what's called a torque multiplier. And basically whatever you put in here, it multiplies it by a certain amount. This one's 4 to 1. So you would take that 308 foot-pounds, divide it by 4, and set your torque wrench. But you've got to add a little bit in for frictional losses. But that's another way to do it if you can find somebody that's got a torque multiplier. To buy a torque multiplier new is probably more expensive than buying one of those torque wrenches. And now we can take that back off. And I'm going to end the video here because I've still got to do distributor O-ring, new radiator hoses, and belts and pulleys. So I'm going to go ahead and do that while everything's apart. But I mean, basically from here on out, everything is just the reverse of when we assembled it. So that's the key points for doing the oil pump cover. If you have any questions, just let us know in the comments. Hopefully this was helpful and you learned something. And if you liked it, please subscribe below and we'll catch you next time. Thanks. Bye.